Greetings sailors and welcome to my look at the tier 9 and 10 German battleships, the Friedrich der Große and the Große Kurfürst. Now the tier 9 in particular, I know it is basically the Frederick the Great, but when I see Friedrich der Große, my brain just goes Fat Freddy, so that's what I'm going to call it. It's the Fat Freddy, yes. I've got no idea if they'll catch on or not, but you never know, it might. There are also some nicknames for the tier 10, but most of them aren't very complimentary. Now, I'm in a bit of a funny position with these. It's been sort of beneficial, the fact that I've waited now until the ships have come out, they've been released, and there's now more of a range of opinions available on them. And the initial reactions from super testers and the YouTubers and streamers that had these things to play was not particularly positive. There are some criticisms that are still valid, but overall these aren't bad ships. It's just they require, I think, a particular playstyle, and it is again a change in playstyle from what you had at tier 6 and 7. I said this in the last video with the mid to high tier ships. You have this kind of step change going from tier 5 to tier 6 and then from tier 6 to tier 7 in terms of first it's the gun caliber and then it's the actual like the playstyle of the ship, the armor layout and so forth. And then going from tier 8 to this thing, it again feels like a rather big change in playstyle. The Bismarck you could just throw around in the water and do silly things, and you can't so much do that with tier 9 and 10. They do still have that turtleback armor though. That has been more or less definitively confirmed by people doing testing in the training room. I think it was, I know, was it Flamu or somebody, or well, possibly multiple somebodies has gone and tested this out. So yes, you do have that turtleback arrangement. But like with the Bismarck, that just means that you are harder to citadel. It doesn't mean that it's hard to do damage to you. Now I will point out very quickly before I start going down the stats, you'll hear music in the background of this. For some reason, when I was recording these on the 5.9 client, the settings all reset, and I put all the visual settings right, but then I wasn't actually wearing my headphones at the time, so I didn't think to check the sound settings, and everything was basically turned up to max, including music, which I normally have turned off. Although I have to say, the World of Warships music is actually pretty good. You can go and listen to the soundtrack separately on SoundCloud, and it's pretty nice. It's just I prefer not to listen to music when I'm playing games. But that's why there is music in the background of these, and normally there isn't. So we're going to start off with hit points. You've got 84,300, which is actually the best at tier 9. The Iowa's got 79,000. The Izumo has just under that. Torpedo protection is 25%, and this is one of the complaints of the entire line, is that torpedo protection all down the line is not good. However, at tier 9, it's tied with the Iowa, and it's slightly worse than the Izumo. The Izumo has 28%, so none of the tier 9s have particularly good torpedo damage mitigation. Armor-wise, as I've said, it has that turtleback armor, but the actual belt armor is 300 at the thickest and 32 mil at the weakest, which is going to be like the bow and the stern. So that's actually, like, in terms of the weakest armor, it's better than the other two, but in terms of the belt armor, it's the worst. But only by a small margin. The Iowa's only got a couple, it's like less than 10 millimeters more belt armor, so it's not... I won't say this is a terrifically well-armored ship. And given that it is a fairly large battleship, not as large as the tier 10, obviously, it's going to take a boatload of HE damage. But that, again, isn't unique at tier 9. With the Izumo in particular, like, well, you can see one burning right there. And I expect the Iowa burns, you know, very nicely as well. But the Izumo, that's one of the things I always, just because it's a very long ship, it is quite easy to hit with HE if you're showing any amount of side at all. Armament, well, we've got two sets of guns to talk about here, because both the tier 9 and 10, uniquely thus far, have actually got a pair of gun options. You have 406mm guns, aka 16-inch guns, or 420mm guns, which are roughly 61.5 inches. You've got a 4x2 turret arrangement, so it's the same as the Bismarck, and for me, honestly, this was probably the biggest reason why I didn't like this ship so much. Because you've only got 8 guns and everyone else gets 9 guns. And it doesn't sound like that big of a difference, but over the course of a battle, it kind of adds up. However, with these 16-inch guns, and I think the 16-inch guns is what you're going to see in all of the replays here, I didn't really have sufficient time to play around with the... I would have liked to have tried the bigger guns and see if I could get a good game with those, but again, it was just time constraints. The 16-inch guns, they do have a faster rate of fire. You've got a 28-second reload on these versus 30 seconds on both the Iowa and the Izumo. The big bonus of this ship over either of those, though, this probably the best thing about it, is the turret rotation. It's 32.7 seconds at its base level. Now you compare that to the 45 seconds and the 40 seconds of the Iowa and the Izumo respectively, and that is pretty good for a high tier battleship. With Expert Marksman you can get that down to 29 seconds, and I'm going to talk about modules here, which is a thing I don't normally do. With the main battery 3 modification, which gives you increased rate of fire at a penalty of increased turret rotation time, even if you use that, you still have, and this is also assuming that you have the main battery 3 modification, you can still get a turret rotation that's only just over your base value at 32.8 seconds. This is 32.7. And this is true for both calibers of guns, by the way, the turret rotation. And for that, you get an increased reload of, well, you can get it down to 24.6 seconds. And I think just because the base turret turn time on, and this is, well, we'll come to the tier 10, but for the tier 9, like what we're at now, I think it is well worth having the main battery 3. Now, I didn't get a chance to experiment with this. It would have been nice if they'd given us like a set of each modules for each ship so we could experiment with different setups. But as it was just if you had enough credits to be able to afford to put all these things on the ships, and enough, you know, well, either to just waste the credits with destroying them on demounts, or if you had enough doubloons to actually pay to demount them, then, you know, that's fine. But I don't have like 100 million credits to spare on my account, unfortunately, so I just went with I kind of guesstimated the setup. So I didn't get a chance to try it with the MB3 equipment, but I think it is probably worth having on this, getting that fast reload and still retaining a very good turret turn time, because 32.8 seconds, even with Expert Marksman, the other two ships still can't reach that. So yeah, I would almost say this is like looking at the numbers, which I didn't do before I put equipment on it. Looking at the numbers, this seems like almost essential equipment. The range, however, is one of the bigger downsides, 20.3 kilometers. You can, I think, mount a module that will extend that. I would have to look up what the actual thing is, though. I don't have one available where I can just like see if it can get the range extending equipment, because I think all the tier 9 and 10 battleships do. Because up till like tier 8, I think it's just the Americans with the plotting room modification, and then tier 9 and 10 everyone gets available. So you could put extra range on that, but the base range is by far the worst at this tier, and it's actually a drop from the Bismarck. The Bismarck has the best range of any of the German battleships, so I found that a bit disappointing. And 20.3 is alright, but there were times when I found that it was just that I was getting spotted by destroyers or whatever that were ahead of the pack, and all of those battleships that were same tier and higher, and even in some, well, in fact lower tier, I think all the tier 8 battleships have a better range than 20.3, that they were engaging me before I could engage them, even though at that range you're not going to hit that much. But it still just would be nice to even have retained the range of the Bismarck. Dispersion value is it's 265 meters at that maximum range, and the Sigma is 1.8. Honestly, I mean, it's the usual German thing that the dispersion doesn't feel fantastic, but it's not like it's completely awful. But it was the fact that like it's not great dispersion plus only 8 guns. I didn't like that so much. The 16.1 inch guns, now the main difference there is that the rate of fire is slower, it's 32 seconds, but again, if you use the MB3 module, you can get that down to 28 seconds, so again, worth using. And the main differences otherwise between them are in the damage values. The 16-inch guns are 12,700 AP Citadel, and the 16.5 are 13,500. You also get better fire chance. You get 41% fire chance, which is true for tier 9 as well. And the velocity of the shells drops slightly, but it is only slightly. It's literally 10 meters a second less. They still have relatively fast shells. Well, I say relatively fast. The AP is better than the Iowa by a considerable margin, but the HE is worse. But the Izumo wins out with a good 60 or so meters a second plus, depending on which shells you're comparing exactly, in terms of its shell velocities. AA is, it's alright. It's actually got better DPS than the Izumo, and it's probably overall better than the Izumo in terms of its AA. The AA suite opens up sooner. Your best AA is in the, well, the single largest chunk of DPS is in the 3.5 kilometer range, but the second best is the 4.5 kilometer range, which is your longest range AA. So your envelope is actually pretty good. Whereas with the Iowa, it's the mid to short range envelope that contains the most DPS. So I found overall it was reasonably effective. Secondaries, you've got 8 double 105 mils and 6 double 150 mils. Again, 7 kilometer range. So once you've got past the Bismarck, I mean, the secondaries cease to be that special. Everybody starts to get the longer ranged secondaries. And so there's not much to write home about there. Speed-wise, it's middle of the pack, 30 knots versus 33 on the Iowa and 28 on the Izumo. 940 meters turn radius, which is slightly worse than the Iowa, and about 50 meters worse than the Izumo. The Izumo stock hull is pretty terrible, but once you get to the Izumo top hull, it's not that bad at all. And the rudder shift is actually conversely best at 17.5 seconds. And on all of these German battleships, I tended to use the rudder shift module, which gives you, what was it, a 20% bonus. So you can get that down to something like 14 or 15 seconds rudder shift response time. Whereas the other two are almost 20 seconds each. So, yeah. Last thing we have to talk about is the detection ranges. Surface detection is 17.3, which is, again, middle of the pack. The Iowa can have 16.2, and the Izumo can have 19.3. With everything, and bear in mind, of course, you can put concealment system on this, you can actually drop it down to 12.6. Now, that assumes you've got camo, the concealment system, and the captain skill. And the captain skill alone is worth 14% reduction. And cumulatively, that lets you bring the entire detection range down by 27%. So 12.6, yeah, but it requires a bit of an investment to get there. Now, the Iowa can do better. That can get down to a maximum of 11.8. The Izumo is dead last. The best you can do there is 14.1. However, having said it's middle of the pack with surface detection, in terms of air detection, it's actually the worst at 16 kilometers. So you could get your surface detection down to be really quite stealthy for a battleship of this size, but if there's planes in the air, they will spot you a long way out. So whether or not there are carriers in the game or not will make a big difference. So we've actually managed to run over into the tier 10 game, but that's fine. I've got 2 tier 10 replays to show you, so we can just start talking about that next instead. Now, both the tier 9 and 10, like the Bismarck, have hydroacoustic search, and it's the German hydroacoustic search, so it's something like 6.5 kilometers range, which is fairly useful, but if you're approaching smoke, you've still got to get reasonably close. But it is going to be, like, it's nice to have it, and it kind of makes up for your very poor torpedo protection, but not really. And on the tier 10, this thing, the Große Kurfürst especially, it's just the sheer size of the thing that makes it a torpedo magnet. You absolutely have to play around the fact that you are so big. Now, I actually liked this more than I liked the tier 9, even though it's still sometimes a really awkward ship to play, just because of its sheer size. And at least part of that was the fact that you've gone from twin turrets to triple turrets, so you've suddenly got 25% more firepower available. Now, when I played this, I'm going to go down the stats again. When I played this, it had 88k maximum hit points, which was only a couple thousand more than the tier 9, but it seems to have been the one sort of front of house change that they've made. There might have been some behind the scenes changes they made to these things between us previewing them and actually them going live, but the noticeable one is that it's now gone up to 105,800 hit points. So that is actually by far the best at tier 10. It's even better than the Yamato. Now, like I said, terrible torpedo protection for its tier. It's 25%, same as the tier 9. The Montana has 37% and the Yamato has a whopping 55%. And that is a shorter ship than this. This is the longest ship in the game. It is a massive torpedo magnet, and because it's so big, it makes dodging those torpedoes a bit tricky, and because the hydro search is it's a fairly limited range and you have to choose when to use it. I mean, okay, it lasts for 2 minutes, which is useful, but if you use it at the wrong time and then you're caught on the cooldown and there's like shimikazes and gearings around the place, then you might find yourself in trouble very rapidly, because even 105,000 hit points is going to go away very, very quickly if you get hit by multiple torpedoes at this tier. And, you know, God help you if you meet a Shimikaze division, for instance. So the guns, again, it's the same choices of guns. This time, as I've mentioned, triple turrets. The reload with the 16-inch guns is actually slightly worse. It's 29 seconds compared to 28. And the 16.5-inch, well, they're the same at 32. Turret turn time is worse than the tier 9, it's 40 seconds, which puts it on a par with the Izumo at tier 9, of the tier 9 battleships, but still it's the best at tier 10. The Montana's not far behind though, it's got 45, and the Yamato has a whopping 72, which is, I think, joint worst in the game, because of course the Warspite gets 72 as well. Expert Marksman will bring that down to 34.5 seconds, and if you've got that main battery 3 modification, well, you can get a 25-second reload, well, 25.5 seconds with the 16 inches, 28.2 seconds with the 16.5 inches, and that will take your turret turn times to 39.1 and, well, also 39.1, well, I don't know why I'm saying respectively there. It's the same turret rotation for each type of gun. So yeah, 39.1 seconds. So it's still marginally better than the base time, and it still puts you ahead of the competition. Although in this case, it doesn't put you ahead of the competition if they also have Expert Marksman, because the Montana with Expert Marksman would get 38-second turret rotation. So it's not a big gap, it's like less than a second. And I think it's still worth using main battery 3 on this, even though the base turret turn time isn't as good as the tier 9. But it's still, you know, it's still not bad. And being able to whip your shells out, like 28 seconds is pretty good. But if you stuck with the 26-inch, not 26-inch guns, wow, 26-inch guns would be nice. The 16-inch guns, getting shots out every 25.5 seconds, that could be pretty powerful. I've not really, so far, by the way, said, like, you know, given a gun recommendation. And of course, the bigger guns are going to have slightly better overmatch properties. But it's an extra 14mm on the caliber, so I don't know. I think it's just personal preference. Some people are going to want the bigger shells because, yes, they do a bit more damage. But other people are going to want the faster rate of fire. Now, they basically have the same dispersion either way. You don't have any advantage or disadvantage there. But I honestly think this is just one of those things where it's going to be a personal preference thing. Some people are going to want that faster rate of fire. Because, you know, 25.5 seconds, that's pretty damn good. Even with the same module, the other tier 10 battleships could only get down to about 26.5 seconds, so you'd still beat them. And they'd suffer worse turret turn penalties as a result, even if they had Expert Marksman. So, yeah, it's a playstyle thing. It's absolutely a playstyle thing. I don't think there is a good, like, I don't think there's a clear choice of, well, these guns are the best and you should use these ones. Range is barely better than the tier 9. You've gotten an extra 300 meters, 20.6 kilometers. So this is even more disappointing than the tier 9 in a way in terms of its range. Again, you can increase that. You could even, hell, on both the Tier 9 and the Tier 10, you could use a spotter plane rather than a fighter plane, although I'm not sure I'd necessarily recommend it. But, yeah, again, everybody is going to be engaging you before you can engage them. Even some of the cruisers will be able to start engaging you before you can engage them. Although, I'm trying to think which cruisers in particular. I'm sure some of the Tier 10 cruisers have above 20 kilometers range. And if they're using spotting planes, then they almost certainly would be able to get over 20 kilometers. Sigma value is the same as the previous tier, 1.8, which is actually the worst of its tier. The Montana gets 1.9 and 2.1. In terms of its dispersion in meters, 268 at max range, which it is the clear worst, because the Montana gets 240 and the Yamato gets 209. They both have much longer maximum ranges. So yeah, this was one of the things with the tier 9 and 10. Again, with the tier 9 it was the dispersion plus the only having 8 guns when everyone else had 9. And at this tier the dispersion's still not improved, but you at least have more guns to work with. So like I said, just more guns alone made me like this a bit better than the tier 9. I actually felt it was easier to do damage in this thing. All of the games I'm going to show you, by the way, are fairly average. None of them are spectacular in terms of damage. There is one game out there already where somebody did like 268k damage just within the first couple of days of these being released, and it got sent to me and a bunch of other people, but somebody's already featured that replay on their channel, so I thought on balance I would just stick with my own replays. But if I remember to, I'll stick a link into the description below, and I can't even remember who covered that replay, but anyway, it was probably a belter of a game. I've not actually had a chance to sit down and watch it. So the shells are exactly the same as previous. It's 12.7k versus 13.5k for the two calibers. 13.5 is actually for the 16.5-inch guns. That's the same damage that the 16-inch guns on the Montana do. So bigger caliber but the same damage. And then the Yamato's monster 18-inch shells, of course, do 14.8k damage because it's a Yamato. HE, however, it's still the winner, which is sort of unusual talking about German HE. The 38% on the 16-inch shells is already better than the others, and then you get that 41% on the 16.5-inch. So if you meet a bow on like Yamato or something, and let's say you don't mind going, you know, or you queue up some HE shells rather than reloading right there and then, because that would be a bit daft with even the quicker reload. But 41% fire chance is massive. You only need a couple of hits and that's almost guaranteed fires. Shell velocities are the same as the previous tiers, 810 meters a second for AP and HE on the 16-inch guns, and then 800 for the 16.5-inch. And this actually makes them, like, even though it's the same values, suddenly it makes them good for their tier. AP is the best for its tier, and then in terms of HE, the Americans still win with 820, but the Yamato is, you know, just worse in both ways. Although the AP shells on the Montana are like the American battleship HE, and I'm now at the North Carolina myself, and it's been a bit of an adjustment getting used to how slow those AP shells are. Compared to like if I was to go back and forth between the North Carolina and the Tirpitz, that would seriously throw me, because the Tirpitz's shells are just so much faster, and the American AP shells are comparatively slow. So yeah, the shell speed is pretty decent. It's not spectacularly fast, but in this case, it puts you slightly ahead of the competition, which is nice. I should note, by the way, when I talk about shell speeds, it's always the initial velocities, because that's what it gives you in the client. There are other factors that affect shell speed. Shell drag is actually a stat in this game, and it was brought to my attention particularly with the York. And I had that Supporter Week video where I was wondering why someone was firing York HE at range. And now I've begun noticing it when I meet Yorks in battle. Yes, they fire HE at range, because even though the initial velocities on the shells, the HE and the AP, are similar if not the same, the drag on the AP shells is significantly worse, and so they slow down quicker. So therefore, the effective shell travel time is actually longer than the HE shells. So it's not just that starting velocity. There are other factors in play. but unless it's something particularly noticeable in terms of the difference between two shell types with the York, it's a little hard to make judgments. Secondaries, you've got 10 twin 128mm mounts and 4 double 150mm mounts. Again, 7 kilometers range, same as the Yamato. I think the Izumo... Does the Izumo have 7 kilometers as well? Yeah, the Americans Tier 9 and 10 have got 6 kilometers, and the Japanese for Tier 9 and 10 have got 7 kilometers as their base range. So you could do, for both Tier 9 and 10, you could do the Bismarck thing. You could do a secondary build and actually get those over 10 kilometer secondaries. But for these particular ships, I don't know. Is it worth it? There's probably more useful modules given the nature of these ships. I think the Bismarck, you can get away with it just because of the nature of the Bismarck. Your AA is, again, it's quite useful because you've got, in fact, more useful than the Tier 9, really. I would say, although the DPS of the Montana is by far and away the best at this tier, if you look at the given ratings, it's 82 for the Kurfürst and only 84 for the Montana, even though the Montana has over 600 DPS in total, and the Kurfürst only has 381. And that's just, it's down to the nature of the envelope. Your best DPS is at 5 kilometers, but your dual-purpose secondaries, which are your longest range DPS, are at 5.2. So, you know, there's not much of a difference between 5 and 5.2, and assuming you've got, you know, AFT and BFT and the like, and if you had manual AA control on the captain, the manual AA skill, I mean, for both Tier 9 and 10, that's going to be useful, but for Tier 10 especially, yeah, you can be, I think, fairly dangerous to planes, but planes are fairly dangerous to you as well because you're so big and your torpedo protection is not good. So because of the sheer length of the thing and because it's not especially maneuverable, I think the better carrier captains are going to learn that they can drop on this thing from further away than they might be able to in other ships. So yeah, it's just that outer envelope. It's the fact that it's got its best DPS at 5 kilometers, and then, or you know, the 5.2 kilometer stuff has already kicked in by that point, and the short range stuff is actually not that good. Whereas on the Montana, it's like 3.5 kilometers is your best, and then like there's a lot of the very short range 2 kilometer DPS, and the actual outer envelope isn't that scary. So even though the overall DPS is much higher, the planes have to get a lot closer before it kicks in. With the Yamato, well, that is all about the short range DPS. It's all, well, short range for the Yamato, its longest is 5 and its shortest is 3.1. It doesn't have any kind of like really short range 2 kilometer stuff, but its best is all at that 3.1 inner envelope. So overall, I would say in terms of its anti-aircraft, you might make a case for this being the best at Tier 10. Maybe. It's not in terms of its overall figures, but thanks to the nature of the way that the AA envelopes work, and you know, with the right captain skills, this could really shred some enemy planes, especially lower tier planes. Speed-wise, 30 knots, which is on a par with the Montana. The turn radius, however, is the worst in the game. Oh well, for a battleship. 1,050 meters. Some of the high-tier carriers, I think, have that or worse. In fact, I think the carriers are already worse from like Tier 8. It is pretty bad. It's over 150, well, no, not over. It is exactly 150 meters worse than the Yamato and 100 meters worse than the Montana. You do, however, get the slight silver lining in that your rudder shift is 19.4. The other two have just over 22 seconds. So again, the rudder shift module I would consider to be a necessity on this. The sooner you can get your rudder response going, the better, but it's not going to help your absolutely oil tanker like turn radius at all. And that is the big issue. It's that combined with its size, combined with its poor torpedo bulge protection. That part of the negative view of this machine, and the Tier 9 to some extent as well, has not gone away. It is hugely vulnerable to torpedoes just from that trio of factors. Surface detection, you are actually the worst. You have 18.2 kilometers, which is 200 meters worse than the Yamato, but that makes sense. It's huge. It's the biggest battleship in the game, so the fact that it's only 200 meters worse than the Yamato, maybe we could consider that to be a saving grace, really. I don't know. You can, however, with, you know, the OP captain skill and the concealment system and everything else, and everything else, the camo. That makes it sound like there's 3 or 4 other things. No, it is just the camo after that point. You can get it down to an absolute best of 13.3 kilometers. However, given the nature of this thing, and even though you have hydro, you might seriously want to consider using the detection equipment instead of the concealment system equipment instead. But this might, again, be another personal preference thing. Some people like to make their battleships as stealthy as they absolutely can. And again, I think that's valid, but again, it's undermined, as with the Tier 9, by the fact that you have the worst air detection range, and this time it's actually quite significant. 18.7 kilometers. Your air detection range is actually worse than your base surface detection range by half a kilometer. So if there are any carriers in the game, you're going to be spotted. Or even if people have scout planes in the air, you're probably going to be spotted. So it completely undermines, like, you might have that 13.3 kilometer surface detection range, but the moment a carrier gets within like a couple of map squares of you with his planes, you're going to be lit up for everybody to see. So it will still be situationally useful to be that stealthy, but honestly, personally, I don't think it's going to be that useful, just because the air detection range is so horrifically bad. I mean, for reference, the Montana's 16.1 and the Yamato is 16. So, yeah. From the air, they're going to see you a long ways off. So, that concludes the stats for both machines. I almost wish I'd had a longer replay for the Tier 9. I don't usually run over into the next tier like that. But the games I had, I mean, none of them were particularly spectacular. But for higher tier battleship games, I mean, to sort of do 110, 120k damage is fairly average for me. I don't think I've ever really had a spectacularly high damage battleship game. My record is probably something like 155k, something like that. I mean, I like battleships a lot, but I rarely seem to have spectacularly high damage games in them. And when you look at what other people do when they're doing over 200k damage, I've never managed anything close to that. Maybe someday, I don't know. So that means I can now talk about the games at hand. And yeah, I was a bit of a punching bag in most of them, but I mean, that's true for any tier 10 battleship. You just sail around, you get spotted a lot, and you get shot at a lot. And in this case, well, I mean, it's kind of useful sometimes. If you can survive the hits, if you can weather it, then you can give your allies a useful space to actually work with. It's sort of like the mouse philosophy, and it really does apply to all of the better armoured ships in warships, but the tier 10s especially. That you should not be afraid of taking hits in this thing. Now, I think the temptation is that you would hang back and absolutely keep your maximum possible distance at all times. And I think that would be honestly doing it wrong in both the tier 9 and the tier 10. If nothing else, doing that would still get you fairly outranged by everything. But also, you will get punished very hard by the worst in tier dispersion. And it's going to make doing damage very, very difficult. But there are times when you're just going to need to keep your distance because there are tier 10 destroyers. Even tier 8 destroyers could be a really serious threat. So it might be an idea that if you ever take these things into battle, just to have some friends along that can screen you in cruisers or other destroyers. Because playing these solo, I think having to just rely on random teammates to spot those torpedoes incoming is going to be tough. And of course you've got the hydro, which is useful, but at really close quarters, if you're trying to get into brawl, I mean in this kind of map for instance, I am actually going to get into one of the cap circles towards the end of the battle, which is only a couple more minutes away, and I'm going to take a bunch of torpedo damage. But it was at a point where I knew it was towards the end of the battle. I could see the battle was winding up, and I just wanted to get in there and get some more damage at closer range. So I think if you were free from the threat of torpedoes, you can absolutely afford to get closer with this ship. But it's the absolute massive main negative downside of this vessel for me, the tier 10 in particular, is just how vulnerable it is to those torpedo drops. And it's not going to take captains of destroyers very long to figure it out. Like, even if they're not the kinds of people that go and watch YouTube videos like this to figure out what a new ship is like, or you know, what a new ship is like to play against, just being in battle against these things, it's not going to take people long to see that, hey, this is a big target that can't move out the way very well, and oh look, when my torpedoes do hit, they actually do way more damage than they would with the Yamato or the Montana, because the torpedo bulge protection is so very poor. So that is the threat, absolutely. And there are a lot of times when you have warning that there's a destroyer in the area, and okay, you can start to do something about it. And for the other times when it's just a complete ambush, well, you'd probably be screwed in whichever battleship you were in. But I think you'd be more screwed in this thing just because of the sheer size of the thing. There's so much less opportunity to dodge out of the way, even though you do still have that slight advantage over the other ships in terms of your rudder response. So it's just, I don't know, it's awkward, and I think if you can hit the groove and find the playstyle that makes it work, then absolutely, both the tier 9 and 10 will probably do quite well. But if you're jumping in and expecting them to play like a super Bismarck, like a big beefier Bismarck, then absolutely not. They are not the same kinds of ships as the Bismarck and the Scharnhorst at all. They just don't have that like combination of qualities that makes the Bismarck such a joy to play. They are ships that require more work. They require much more attention to be paid to torpedo threats, especially like carriers and destroyers. And if you do it wrong, you're going to go down hard and fast, and it doesn't matter that you have the most health in your tier, because, you know, torpedoes don't care. Torpedoes will take that away very, very quickly. And even fire damage, well, it's multiple fires is going to also add up very quickly. Although in this particular game, I don't think I really had much issue with fires. So this is the end point when I'm just, like, I can see that we are more ahead on points. The enemy don't have that many ships left, and I just want to get a bit closer and see how it performs when I'm not sailing around at like 18 plus kilometers range. However, I do know that there is a destroyer reasonably close. So it's kind of a trade-off. I'm taking the risk of torpedoes here for the reward of doing more damage, and having citadeled that rune, well, it's sort of paid off already. That was quite a nice salvo. So they know I'm here. They definitely know I'm here. I use this moment to pop my hydro for the first time, because there's almost certainly going to be torpedoes coming through the gap if the was it a Benson or something like that? Can't quite see on the preview screen. But if that ship is there and he's got torpedoes available, then hell yes, he's going to start firing at me. Now with just AFT and BFT, I don't think I had the secondary module on the Große Kurfürst here. My secondaries are still opening up on these guys, and there's the Benson. Okay, yes. And there's really not a lot I can do about it. I took the risk, and I can turn in and try and beach myself on the island, because of course that rune has torpedoes as well. But I'm still inevitably going to take some of these Benson torpedoes. There's just no way to avoid it. And because you're so long, like the fact that I only took, what was that, 2 or 3? I wasn't paying attention there, but the fact that I didn't eat more than that was more down to how the Benson dropped the torpedoes rather than me actually taking evading action. However, I was able to use the island to shield myself from that route. So they've lost a couple more ships. That Montana, I think he's going to be the last ship to go down, and he's going to be the one that clinches us enough points to win. Now at this range, I probably, like, at this angle, I probably could have maybe tried to make chi for my last salvo or two. Not that there really would have been a chance to rack up any fire damage just because we're so close to the end, but they would have done more than that AP salvo I fired just there. And I think I maybe get to fire one more salvo. Can't remember if it does any damage though. I would have been really, like, now I've run the numbers, I would have been really curious to see, or I am really curious to see what it would have felt like with that main battery 3 modification in place of whatever else it was I had on this. Probably the dispersion reducing module, but I can't remember if that's the same slot or not. I'm not sure. I can't remember. It might not be actually. I think it might be a different slot. But yeah, I think that alone, just having that faster rate of fire without really having a massive penalty in terms of turret turn time, I think that could still, like, that could make the ships feel a bit less awkward. That could really open up the playstyle a bit. But I'll never know, or at least I won't know until I, you know, eventually get these things. Because I do want to play the Germans, and principally I want to play the German battleships for the Bismarck, because the Bismarck is fun. But tier 9 and 10, I think they're still are workable ships. They can still be good, but they are less overall fun. They're harder work, and they stop having some of the uniqueness of the lower tier German battleships, where you've got generally better ranges on your secondaries. You've generally got really, you know, like good AA, or maybe not best in class AA, and that's still true for tier 9 and 10, but it's less special for its tier. Well, both tier 9 and 10 are less special for their tier, and they're not even special for their tier with the secondaries. They're just kind of overall average. Although I think, having said that, I think all of your secondaries on the tier 9 and 10 are HE throwers, and I'm not sure if that's true for the Yamato. I think some of the Yamatos are AP throwers, but I'm pretty sure the Montana's secondaries are all HE throwers. Anyway, so that concludes my look at the German battleship line overall, and I think they were alright. I think this has been a good addition to the game. They definitely overall offer something a bit different in terms of the playstyle. They offer some things a bit different in terms of playstyle, as I've said in this video and previous videos. And although I still think tier 9 and 10 could stand to be buffed, I don't have the initial kind of like reaction that I had when I first played them with, oh my god, these things are terrible, how would anybody ever want to play these now? I think that was just being unfamiliar with what's required to actually get the best out of them. They can perform well, it's just, you know, you have to work at it and you have to adjust to actually fit what the ship requires. But they're still sometimes very awkward, especially the tier 10, and that weakness to torpedoes is I think it still makes it, honestly, not a great tier 10. I think, I haven't played the Montana, but I think overall the Montana is probably the better ship. And I would say the Yamato is definitely the better ship. But other people might disagree with me. So hopefully you found this look at the top tiers of the new German battleships useful. And if you have, you can hit the like button, you can leave any comments below, you can sub to my channel if you haven't already, and as always, stay tuned for more.